These are the lecture notes for Chapter 18, the urinary system. I'm going to skip through the learning outcomes and go on to major functions of the urinary system. The major functions are excretion. In fact, sometimes the urinary system is referred to as the excretory system. So the functions are excretion, elimination, and homeostatic regulation. Excretion of organic waste such as urea from body fluids. Elimination of these wastes into the external environment. And then homeostatic regulation of volume and solute concentration of the blood. This is a diagram of the organs of the urinary system. This is pretty simple. You have the kidneys, which produce the urine, and then you have these tubes called ureters that extend from each kidney to the urinary bladder, and the urinary bladder temporarily stores the urine, and then you have the urethra, which conducts urine to the exterior, and in males, the urethra also transports semen. The notes on the organs of the urinary system, just make sure you know the two kidneys produce the urine. The urinary tract includes the two ureters, the urinary bladder, and the urethra. And then the process, the elimination of urine, that process is called urination or micturition. Either term can be used to refer to urination. So urination or micturition. So in addition to removing organic waste, the urinary system regulates blood volume and blood pressure by regulating the amount of water that's released with the urine. It regulates the concentration of plasma ions, such as sodium, potassium, chloride, and calcium. Helps stabilize blood pH and conserves valuable nutrients like glucose and amino acids. As far as the location of the kidneys, I just want you to be able to compare the right versus the left and make sure that you know the right kidney sits slightly lower than the left kidney because of the liver, because of the position of the liver. It kind of pushes the right kidney down a little further than the left. Also know that the kidneys are retroperitoneal, which means they are behind or dorsal to the peritoneum, and that the adrenal glands sit on top of each kidney. So here you can see, and this is the posterior view of a person. So you're looking at them, from the back, and the right kidney is a little bit lower than the left kidney, and that's because the liver is up here. Okay, and they are close to the back because they're behind the peritoneum. Okay. All right, now, as far as the structure of the kidney, let's look at the picture A first, and I'm going to blow it up so we can see it. There we go. All right, the outside, very outside of the kidney is enclosed or covered by a fibrous capsule. So there's a capsule as far as the covering. Then the outermost layer of the kidney is called the renal cortex. Renal refers to kidney. So that outermost layer is called the renal cortex. Then the layer deep to the cortex, or kind of underneath it, this level all the way around is called the renal medulla. So what you find in the renal medulla are the renal columns, and those are in between the renal pyramids. So the renal pyramids and the renal columns make up the renal medulla. Let's see, we also have the minor calyx extends from each pyramid. So there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 minor calyces on average. I don't think it's always the exact same, but there's 7 here. anyway, there's one minor calyx for each pyramid, for each renal pyramid. And then the minor calyx will drain into the major calyx. And there's a major calyx here and here and here. And the major calyces drain into the renal pelvis. The renal pelvis drains into the ureters. Okay, so all of these drain the urine that's produced by the kidney tubules into eventually the ureters and the bladder and the urethra. The portion of the renal pyramids that enters into the minor calyx, that's called the renal papilla. And then a kidney lobe is defined by this dashed line. So this is a lobe of the kidney here. Okay, so then let's go over to picture B and look at individual kidney tubules called nephrons. They start in the cortex. The kidney tubule consists of the renal corpuscle, the PCT or proximal convoluted tubule, and then that extends in the juxtaglomerular nephrons, which we'll talk more about, the ones that extend down into the pyramids, into the medulla of the kidney. That would be called the nephron loop. And then there are some nephrons called cortical nephrons, and they don't extend down as far. But anyway, we're just going to look at the juxtamedullary nephrons. And so here's the renal corpuscle, the PCT, the nephron loop, which extends down and then back up, down and then back up, and then forms into the DCT or distal convoluted tubule, the collecting duct, the papillary duct, and that empties into a minor calyx. So that's how the structure of the kidney works. We're going to go into a lot more detail about the nephrons and the blood supply. So blood supply to the kidneys begins with, we'll do picture A again. The blood supply begins with a portion of the kidney called the renal hilum, which is like the indention. And that indention is where the renal artery enters, and it's where the renal vein leaves, and it's also where the ureters exit. So this little indention is called the renal hilum. And as far as the blood supply, it goes renal artery, and then that branches into the segmental arteries. And those branch into So from the segmental arteries, the arteries branch into the interlobar arteries. I apologize for all the pauses. I'm just going to start over because I've gotten interrupted a few times. So here's the renal artery. It branches into the segmental arteries. So you can see the segmental arteries. The segmental arteries end up branching into the interlobar arteries. And then you see how that kind of comes around here. So the this artery is called the arcuate artery. So it's interlobar arteries, and then arcuate arteries would be these that kind of come around the top part of the pyramid. And then you have these little arteries that kind of radiate into the cortex, and so they're called cortical radiate arteries. And now they're going to branch into much, much, much smaller capillaries that aren't even named. But once the blood supplies the kidney, then it's going to be drained away from the kidney. And so we'll start with the cortical radiate veins, and then those empty into the arcuate veins, and the arcuate veins empty into the interlobar veins, and those empty into the renal vein. So the only thing that doesn't really overlap is there's no segmental veins. There's segmental arteries that branch from the renal artery, but there's not any segmental veins. But all the other blood vessels overlap. You have you have cortical radiate veins and cortical radiate arteries. You have arcuate veins, arcuate arteries. Interlobar veins and interlobar arteries. So we'll go over that more in the notes, but I just wanted you to see a picture first. And then if we move over to picture B, you can see that there is blood supply also to each nephron. And the arteriole that enters into the nephron, into the renal corpuscle, is called the afferent arteriole, and then the one that leaves is called the efferent arteriole. But you can see kind of blown up here the interlobar artery that branches from the segmental arteries. So here's the interlobar artery, and then it's going to go into, it's not shown here, but this is the arcuate arteries. These are the cortical radiate arteries, and then what branches out from the cortical radiate arteries is the afferent arterioles, and they supply the nephrons. So again, we'll go over this a little bit more within the notes. The blood supply to the kidney is listed here, beginning with the renal artery and ending with the renal veins. So blood flow starts with the renal artery, then the segmental arteries, interlobar arteries, arcuate arteries, cortical radiate arteries, afferent arterioles, and inside of the renal corpuscle you have the glomerular capillaries, or the glomerulus, and then blood leaves the renal corpuscle by the efferent arterioles. Then you have the peritubular capillaries that surround the nephrons. Now the blood is going to empty into the cortical radiate veins, the arcuate veins, interlobar veins, and then finally the renal veins. Now, the peritubular capillaries that surround the nephrons have two possible paths depending on the type of nephron. So we have cortical nephrons that are located almost completely inside of the renal cortex. They're not as long. And blood flows from the peritubular capillaries directly into the cortical radiate veins. But in the longer nephrons, the juxtamedullary nephrons, the peritubular capillaries are connected to the vasa recta, which run parallel to the long nephron loops. And then blood flows from the vasa recta into the cortical radiate veins. So you can see in this picture that you have, let's first make sure you understand the difference between a cortical, here's a cortical nephron. See how it's mostly in the cortex? And then here is a juxtamedullary nephron in picture B. I'll blow it up. Here we go. All right. So the cortical nephron is this portion. This is a cortical nephron. All right. This is a juxtamedullary nephron. See how the nephron loop extends way down into the medulla, into the renal pyramid, and then back up. So as far as the blood supply to a cortical nephron, here's what you have. You have the afferent arteriole. Remember that branches off. These are the little branches from the cortical radiate arteries. Okay, so you have the afferent arteriole that enters into the glomerular capillaries, or glomerulus. It's worded both ways. But the afferent arteriole, the glomerular capillaries, the efferent arteriole, and then the peritubular capillaries. And all of these are called peritubular capillaries, and they eventually are going to drain into the cortical radiate veins. Okay? Now, if it is a juxtamedullary nephron, your peritubular capillaries branch into the vasa recta, and the vasa recta run parallel to the nephron loop, and then they are going to drain into the cortical radiate veins. So that is how the blood supply works. Now we're going to go over the parts of the nephron, because each nephron filters a certain amount of blood and produces a certain amount of urine, and there are millions of nephrons in the kidney. The nephron is the basic functional unit of the kidney, and it consists of two parts, the renal corpuscle and the renal tubule. And this is small, so let me blow it up again. Okay, so here we have a juxtamedullary nephron, and you can see the renal corpuscle, which is where filtration occurs. This is where the blood is filtered and then it's processed in the renal tubules. But the renal corpuscle consists of the glomerulus, which is this kind of ball of capillaries. Glomerulus and glomerular capillaries are the same thing. And then the portion of the nephron, so the blood vessels are called the glomerulus, but this cup is called the glomerular capsule. Okay, so it's the glomerular capsule as well as the glomerulus that forms the renal corpuscle, and that is the beginning portion of every nephron. And you can also see here the afferent arteriole branches into the glomerulus or glomerular capillaries, and then the efferent arteriole takes blood away. So all of the blood that's in this glomerulus is filtered and collects in this cup called the glomerular capsule. And then it's called filtrate. It's not called urine yet. The filtrate enters into the PCT, proximal convoluted tubule, and the main process that occurs here is called reabsorption. So all the stuff is filtered out of the blood into this capsule, and then when it enters the PCT, the important stuff is reabsorbed back into the blood, because we don't want to lose the glucose and the amino acids and the important nutrients. We don't want that to be excreted with the urine. We want it back in our blood so it can get to our cells, so our cells can get the nutrients that they need. So the PCT functions in reabsorption back into the blood. And then you have the nephron loop. This is called the descending limb, and then the ascending limb, which functions in concentrating the urine. And then you have the DCT, which will secrete different substances back into the urine. That's basically what happens there. And there's some reabsorption that happens at the DCT. But then finally, what enters the collecting duct is called urine, and then the urine travels into the papillary duct, and then the minor calyx, major calyx, renal pelvis, and ureters.